Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Module 5, where we are returning to Jung and yoga to look at Jung's lectures on Kundalini yoga. So this is going to follow up from the Jung and the East portion from our residential. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. Okay, so here we are. Time is flying. Already in Module 5. So let's begin here with our translation of the text in question. So it's a little complicated. It's a thorny history. So let's go through this from the beginning. So the translator, or one of the translators, as we'll see, of the text that Jung uses in his lectures on Kundalini yoga is Sir John Woodruff, who is an Oxford-educated judge in the Calcutta High Court. So he's British. Right? So there are certain and very real colonial implications that are inherent in the transmission of Tantra to the European West. Now, this is part of a larger trend that Woodruff was part of and certainly helped initiate, but it goes back to some of the earliest European translators, people like Max Muller, for example, and his Sacred Books of the East series. These were some of the first Eastern texts, particularly tantric texts, to be translated into either English or European languages. And as part of this translation, and I almost want to put that term or that word in scare quotes, because as part of this translation, there's a what the religious studies scholar Hugh Urban refers to as a deodorization process, deodorized Tantra. In other words, Tantra, which mostly in the European imagination had been associated with sorcery and black magic, because there certainly are magical texts and tantric practitioners who operated as sorcerers. But what John Woodruff does, and what Hugh Urban deconstructs, is the censorship that Woodruff undertook in his sort of self-imposed reform and moralization of the tantras. He wanted them to be more socially accepted, to be more respectable, particularly among Brahmanical or what we would call upper class or higher class Hindu culture and society. And here's a quote from Hugh Urban describing Woodruff. Describes him as an apologist, a tantric apologist, seeming to have bent over backward to defend the tantras against their many critics and to prove that they represent a noble, pure, and ethical philosophical system in basic accord with the Vedas and Vedanta. In other words, he wants to clean up the tantras to make them more socially acceptable, and that's what he does. So there's a specific hermeneutic bent and underlying agenda to Woodruff's work here. So the texts that we receive are not always entirely represented authentically as they might have appeared within their tradition. So what is the text in question? We're talking about the Sat Chakra Narupana, which is a 16th century Indian tantric text that was published under the name Arthur Avalon. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the series of books that quote unquote Avalon published. There's a whole slew of them. There's a whole series of tantric texts. But who is Arthur Avalon? Arthur Avalon is actually the pseudonym for a dual identity of Sir John Woodruff plus the Hindi interpreter, the Sanskritist A.B. Ghose. And together they publish under the English title, The Serpent Power, in 1918, this text that then comes to Jung's attention and that he bases his commentary on. Now, translating tantric texts is notoriously challenging and difficult because of what is referred to by the tantrikas themselves as twilight language, the Sandha Bhasa. and intentionally ambiguous and multi-layered, we could call it a discourse or multi-layered, very highly symbolic use of language, where, for example, one word, such as bindu, which translates from the Sanskrit as drop, can also refer to as a meditational focus point, and in the tantric tradition, also as semen or seminal fluid. So when you combine, for example, the bindu with the amrita, which translates as nectar, but also as female sexual fluids, sometimes feminine fluids, when you combine the bindu with the amrita, you can see where we're getting here with the kind of alchemical tantric symbolism, where when these two become combined, that's they produce the elixir of immortality, or what we would call in the European alchemical tradition, the philosopher's stone. All right, so there's a very strong comparison between tantric texts and alchemical texts, as we looked at in the residential, that require both metaphorical as well as metaphysical translation. All right, so that's very important. It can be very dangerous to literalize these texts and oftentimes the practices themselves versus looking at them in a symbolic capacity. All right, so another way to frame this is that it's not all about sex unless or until it is. Because the tantric texts notoriously and explicitly, but also in very complicated coded ways, do refer to sexual practices and sexual acts, but not necessarily in the way that the way that the tantra has become popularized in the late 20th and early 21st century imaginations. Okay, a really good book that unpacks all of this is David Gordon White's Kiss of the Yogini, which came out only almost 20 years ago, but is still the sort of standard text in the field about quote unquote tantric sex and trying to parse out what actually was happening versus how people want to imagine what actually happened. Okay, so let's dive into some background on Jung's lectures on Kundalini yoga. He offered them in October, November of 1932. So this was the period when Jung was sort of really at his prime, or I should say his comparative psychology of religion was really at its prime. And the background is that the German scholar, Indologist Wilhelm Hauer gave 6 lectures on Kundalini yoga in Zurich in October of 1932. Now, it's important, as Sonu Shamdasani notes in his introduction, to note that Hauer's later affiliation, his National Socialist or Nazi sympathies, and that actually led to a split with him and Jung later on in his career. But it's very important to highlight that because this was part of how you can see how South Asian, particularly Hindu symbolism becomes appropriated by the National Socialist Party, which is something that I'm sure many of you are aware of and has received a lot of attention in scholarship. So Jung offers 4 lectures responding to Hauer's 6 lectures, and we can see the pattern here where Jung works with a scholar. This is something we see in his Eranos lectures. This is something we saw previously with his Secret of the Golden Flower. So a scholar will present a text or present a translation. It's a European scholar, usually translating some sort of Eastern text, whether it's Indian or Chinese or Tibetan. And then Jung does the psychological commentary. So this is a theme that's emerging for Jung in the 1930s. And the context here is that it's very interesting that the translation and the emergence of these texts, many of them are appearing, as I mentioned, in European languages for the first time, parallel, but also inform the emergence of analytical psychology, right? So it's I want to say a colonialist comparativism, but I don't necessarily mean that in a necessarily pejorative or overly critical way, because one of the things that happens through processes like colonialism is that it's a way that in which cultures do come into communication with one another. I'm certainly not justifying in any way colonial attitudes, but part of that, part of the coming together of cultures in that capacity is this sort of sharing and bridging of knowledges and traditions. And it's through Jung's comparativism that he actually is able to more fully flesh out or amplify what becomes Jungian psychology. So he's able to look, for example, at modern psychopathology from the perspective of the awakening of Kundalini, right? Or what Shamdasani refers to as a cross-cultural comparative psychology of inner experience, which I think is a perfect phrase to really define or understand Jung as a comparative scholar of religion. And one of the things that we see as Eastern spiritual practices begin to transmit not only to Europe, but also and later into the United States, which seems to happen every 30 or so years. So we saw this in the early 1900s, 1930s, 1960s, again in the 90s. And into today. So, but each time there's been a wave or sort of a recurring crest of the wave of Eastern spiritual practices, Jung has been the thread, which is something that's very interesting. And we'll take a look at that in a minute at how that's emerged in contemporary culture. Now, of course, the critique. So what's the critical perspective? This is, again, something Shamdasani notes in his introduction. It's important to parse out or demarcate Jung's psychological interpretation of Kundalini yoga versus Kundalini yoga as it's understood and practiced on Indian soil from the medieval, 12th century or so up until the 16th and even up until the 19th century and today. It's just like we did with looking at John Woodruff and separating out his interpretation of the Tantra versus what Tantrikas actually practiced and thought themselves. We have to do the same thing with Jung. All right, so Jung is offering a psychological interpretation that might not necessarily or is not necessarily an accurate description of Kundalini yoga itself. So once again, we have this delicate dance between yes, we can certainly do psychological interpretation, but we also have to do the historical work and the deep digging and bring in the contemporary religious studies piece as well, if we really want to understand the traditions that Jung is doing this interpretive work with. Okay, so what is a chakra? Chakra translates as wheel from the Sanskrit. So what Woodruff offers in his Serpent Power very helpfully is what he calls an overview of the 6 centers. And I'll show you that diagram in a minute, where he looks at each individual chakra, its location, the petals, how many petals are around its symbol center, the bija, the seed, which is and the letter, the syllable, the mantra that goes with each chakra, the tattva, which is the element for each chakra, the color, the shape, the devata, the shakti, which are the deities, the male and the female deities that reside within each chakra. I'll show you that in a minute. Woodruff defines the chakra as a center of consciousness. Now, this is something that will carry throughout history, not only through Jung, but also into the present day. People like Anodea Judith and what emerged in the late 20th century as yoga psychology, which really had its own sort of heyday, actually probably even going back into the 1970s. So yoga psychology was a way to bridge East and West through the discipline of psychology, which is something that was maybe one of the most impactful inroads of Eastern traditions, whether Buddhist or yogic or Hindu, onto American soil, was through the discipline of psychology. We'll also take a look at the physiology, or the supposed physiology, potential physiology of the chakra system through the nerve ganglia of the human nervous system. And then it's also important to note the use of chakras in the New Age, or we could say the appropriation, or sometimes the misappropriation, or just the loose use of the chakra system, whether it's through Reiki, crystals, types of, I guess what we could say alternative or non-traditional healing. I'm not diminishing any of this. I'm just stating it as a cultural sort of fact and observation of the ways in which something that is a very old Indian yogic phenomenon that probably goes back to, I mean, we have evidence of chakras or chakra-like thinking all the way back to the Upanishads, the Yoga Sutra, and then these sorts of tantric systems evolving by the 6th and 9th century. So these are very old, contextually embedded systems that in our contemporary spiritual but not religious imagination have sort of been cut loose from their geographical soil and now just kind of float about, right? And for those of you that are California consciousness folks, or people that are just you know this world, you don't have to be a Californian, you know that it's everywhere, it's all pervasive. So there's the cross-cultural perspective as well, because there's folks that have taken the chakra system and they've transposed it onto shamanic and indigenous forms of healing as well. So lots to talk about here, very complicated, very multifaceted cultural phenomenon here of how the chakras have traveled throughout time. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all of this. If you want to pause the recording here, you can take a look at Woodruff's chart here. He goes through each one of the chakras, and as I mentioned earlier, he goes through the petals, the letters or the seed syllables, the shape, everything here, the animals. So you can do that at your leisure. One of the things that's interesting is that David Gordon White, in the book I mentioned previously, when talking about these different Shaktis, he refers to them as potentially nonsense words, because we do the Dakini is a female tantric goddess figure, but these other names, the Rakini, Lakini, Kakini, Sakini, Hakini, these are not necessarily phrases that are terms that appear in other literature. So David Gordon White says that they might be nonsense words, not that Woodruff made up, but like just as they appear in the tradition. I just thought that was sort of an interesting footnote. Okay, so here's just some examples of what we see in our contemporary culture. This sort of simple chakra chart here, you see this on the walls of, I don't know, many yoga studios in America. This is sort of the contemporary cultural appropriation of this ancient tradition. Here's Anodea Judith's book that I think was a very big seller and might still be, Eastern Body, Western Mind, which introduced a lot of people to the chakra system as a psychology, a somatic psychology as well. And it's very interesting. It's a very interesting book. She overlays a lot of different kinds of psychological systems and puts them in context with the chakras. Okay, and here's a map of the nervous system, potentially as the energy body. You know, the way that our nervous system is laid out looks and sounds a lot like how texts as old as the Upanishads describe the subtle body or the energy body, as portrayed here by Alex Gray. If you look at the center image, you can see the nerve ganglia. You can see the way in which the nervous system tends to clump at certain parts of the body, which create a heightened sensitivity or a heightened awareness. And that does include places like the base of the spine, the intestines, the gut or the solar plexus area, the heart. I mean, you see where we're going here. There are very strong connections between the nervous system and our subtle body center. And for those of you that know Chinese medicine, there's similar connections and correlations there as well. Okay, so let's get into each of the actual chakras, beginning with Muladhara. So I like this quote from Jung that each chakra is a whole world. I love that because there's a lot going on. There's an entire psychology, there's an entire subtle anatomy, there's an entire world within each one of these layers of consciousness, if we want to use that frame. So the way that Jung understands or interprets Muladhara is the realm of ego consciousness. So this is the realm that most folks are sort of living their life. This is William James' normal waking consciousness. This is the self that ties the shoes and does the dishes and drives the car and makes breakfast. And as it should be, right? Because Jung describes this as being in the roots. It's a place of being rooted. You know, many of us have obviously experiences of feeling ungrounded. That's a very sort of popular phrase in yoga culture. I feel really ungrounded. How do we get grounded? We return to our root. We do grounding practices. You know, for those of you that are Ayurvedic people, we eat root vegetables, particularly in the wintertime. So there's ways that we can root down. This is that center of consciousness, which Jung describes as reality, basic reality as we touch it. It's the reality principle in a certain sense from Freud, right? And yet, the self, perhaps the self should have a capital S here, the self with a capital S is asleep, which means that all things concerning the gods are asleep. So in other words, the archetypal, the realm of the archetypal has not yet awakened, right? As Jung says, very much the situation of our modern consciousness, which tends to be very what? Materialistic, rooted in the material. And again, there's for better or for worse, right? We live in a very hyper-materialistic society, but it's also, of course, a positive thing to be rooted, to be in Muladhara firmly, right? And yet, as Jung states, the gods are asleep. There's not much of awakened sense of consciousness. And yet, in the center, in the very center of this field of consciousness, there is a germ of something that points to a different kind of consciousness. And this is the symbol that you see above the elephant. It is the lingam, which represents dormant consciousness. The lingam is, of course, a symbol of Shiva, and wrapped around the dormant or sleeping lingam is the sleeping snake, Kundalini, who is personified as feminine. So there's a sleeping feminine energy that's wrapped around sleeping dormant consciousness, essentially, right? So Shiva and Shakti are essentially asleep. It is not until we enter into Swadhisthana that, as Jung says here, we begin the night sea journey. We wrestle with the great monster, the Leviathan, which threatens one with annihilation. Annihilation by what? The awakening to the waters of the unconscious. So interestingly, and perhaps ironically, whereas in the European West, in the American inheritance here, we tend to think of Jungian psychology as this descent. We descend in order to awaken. We go on our hero's journey into the underworld. Everything is about descent. Same thing with Hillman, going down, going down. But in this yogic system, we actually ascend, we go up a level to Svadhisthana, and we awaken through entering the waters of the unconscious. So this is where we do the night sea journey, right? This is what Jung says, that the way into any higher development leads through the water. So the second chakra, located, we could just say around or above the genitals, represented by this crescent moon, this half moon, which certainly can be a symbol for the feminine, for the womb, for the hips, that which holds, that which contains, but also there is the potential for this Leviathan, this sea creature, which can be threatening to egoic consciousness, right? If it's not prepared or it hasn't yet been initiated. So the second chakra here is initiation through water, which Jung connects with baptism, rebirth, destruction, flooding, again, annihilation of the ego, whatever it takes in order to be initiated into the mysteries. So this is the entering and the awakening of the unconscious, or what Jung interprets as the unconscious or unconscious forces, the world of emotion represented by water. And of course, Jung had his own experience of this in his Red Book. He creates an almost identical image. I don't know exactly the year that this was painted, but it would have been probably in the 1920s. So potentially, it was definitely after The Serpent Power was published. If Jung would have had knowledge of that text yet, I'm not entirely sure, but it's very similar. Here we almost have a similar sort of crescent moon in the shape of the barge, only here we have the sort of the golden egg, which is ferried across consciousness, so it's protected. It's not annihilated by the Leviathan. So this is more of a symbol in a certain sense of maybe we could say, I don't know about integration, but it's a little more protected here. So very similar iconography. Okay, when we move into Manipura, this is the third center. Jung says this is the place where the sun rises. We're now in the fire element, symbolized by here the ram, and the color is red. So we're in a world of heat. We're in a world of fire. It's the world of power, the solar plexus. Schopenhauer's will to power. I remember hearing Anna Dea Judith do a lecture a while ago about how humanity is sort of stuck and wrestling with this transition between the third and the fourth chakras, moving from the will to power, struggling to move into the heart center, which we'll look at next. So in many instances, Western humanity has been in the solar plexus, in this sort of power center for a long time. I mean, this is the energy of dominance. This is the energy of warfare. This is a very yang energy. It's a very masculine energy, again, symbolized by the ram, very forceful. One thing that Jung says that's interesting here about the increase of consciousness, as we move up the system, we increase consciousness over previously unconscious realities. So as we move out of the watery realm of emotion, we move more into the sort of gut center of power and mastery of emotion. So we're not just stuck in the realm of the Leviathan, but we're able to sort of move up a level in our elevator of consciousness here to gain some sort of mastery over our emotional reality. So we're not just constantly swimming or adrift at sea, but of course, being stuck or trapped in a place of will to power is also not desirable. So we move up into Anahata, which is the heart center. And if you notice the symbol here, you'll see that it is a symbol of integration, because we have the union here of above, the upward pointing triangle, and below, the downward pointing triangle. So this union of above and below, there's an energetic pathway that's going in both directions that yokes, which is, remember, where we get the word yoga, or the other way around. There's a yoking of above and below in the heart. So the heart is a very important image and symbol of integration. And Jung has here probably one of my favorite quotes in the entirety of Jung's collected works, that there is an extraordinary distance from the head to the heart, a distance of 10, 20, 30 years, or a whole lifetime. I think this is very true. This is very wise. I think I've also seen this in a Sufi saying. I'm sure this appears across religious traditions, but this distance between the head and the heart, and how it can really be a difficult achievement or accomplishment to begin to touch into this center. I think we make a lot of the heart and being in the heart space, or having heart connections with people, or being heartfelt. This is, in a certain sense, an achievement of consciousness, is to move into this realm, which Jung also associates with the spirit, because it's connected to the air element. So spiritus, Animus in the medieval sense, not in the sense of that Jung uses anima and animus. Animus is Latin, another Latin term for the spirit or the spiritual part of the soul. And also ruach in the Hebrew tradition, which is connected with the breath of life, and the breath that Yahweh breathes into Adam to create life. But the important part of this section that really resonates with me is what I think this is Jung's very brilliant psychological move, is connecting this with the impersonal. So we're lifted above one's own sort of stormy emotional realities, but we're also lifted above one's own will to power and power drive, so that we're no longer identical with these quote unquote lower aspects of human being or human nature. It's no longer just about the feeling function, but it's also no longer just about power or getting one's own way. We're now in the more impersonal dimension. So there's an objectivity, and Jung connects this with the beginnings of individuation. There's an objectivity. There's a certain development of what Jung refers to as the thing which is not the ego, the thing that is not the ego. So we're starting to step out of egoic consciousness or egoic developmental psychology, and now we can develop that which is not just about the I. And Jung connects this with the very old notion of the Purusha, which again goes back to the Upanishads. The Purusha is the person the size of the thumb that lives in the heart. And this we could connect with the self, with the capital S. So it's the beginning of a connection between the ego and the self, to use that sort of classical Edward Edinger kind of overlay. And then once we're established in the heart, we can move up to the throat, which is connected with Vishuddha. And in this chakra, Jung makes the connection between the tantric tradition and medieval alchemical philosophy or psychology, the transformation of the gross into the subtle. So we're moving into more and more subtle regions of the body, subtle natures of consciousness. And there's something that's very purificatory about this. I remember reading somewhere, it might be in Ana Dea Judith or some of the more popular chakra stuff, about how the body creates a bottleneck. So as we travel up the body, consciousness sort of needs to be more and more refined, just like in the alchemical alembic. The different materials and gases need to travel through these different tubes, and they get very, very thin and get very, very compressed. It's the same thing with consciousness as it travels through the body. So as it moves through the throat, it gets there's a purification process, a sort of a sublimatio, a sublimation that happens as we separate the psychical from the material. So there's a withdrawing of projections that happens as we move through this realm, perhaps psychologically or spiritually. This powerful quote: the world itself becomes a reflection of the psyche. The world itself becomes a reflection of the psyche. So we can withdraw projections and we can start to see reality, see matter for what it is, which in its most spiritualized sense is the corollary of mind and matter. It's not just about the separation, as we saw with the Yoga Sutras or in quote unquote classical yoga, where it's about the isolation of matter and spirit. In the tantric tradition, we see that matter and spirit are actually two sides of the same coin, because they're connected through that central channel that you see in the image here. Right? Matter and spirit are ultimately inverse of one another. And the element that's connected with the Vishuddha is ether. So we're not even on this planet anymore. We're now in outer space. So there's the element of space, which the Vajrayana tradition makes a lot of ether and space and spaciousness. It's the primary in the Vajrayana. It's the primary, the fundamental nature of mind is etheric. It is space. It is spaciousness. This is what they refer to as the Dzogchen. Right? The basis of mind, the basis of reality is spaciousness. So that's the kind of psychology or layer of consciousness or world of consciousness that we're in with Vishuddha. Right? And you'll see here in the image that the elephant that we saw in Muladhara returns in Vishuddha. Right? In this quote from Jung, that the power that forces you into consciousness sustains you. Right? So the elephant that returns here is sustaining us in this element of space and ether. This is very brilliant. You would think that you're in outer space, you're totally let loose, you're totally sort of adrift, but no, here is the animal symbol from the root chakra. So the idea here is, how do we root in the quality of spaciousness? How do we root in ether? How do we root into the etheric so that we can, as Jung says, make reality out of concepts? How do we make reality another way to say this is, how do we stabilize spirit, which again is an alchemical art of stabilizing mercury, right? How do we stabilize the etheric? How do we stabilize spaciousness, right? I think this is very brilliant on Jung's part. I think this is one of the ways in which we see that a psychological interpretation can really work and can actually unpack new layers of understanding and meaning. Okay, finally with Agnya, the psyche gets wings. Another great quote from Jung. In Agnya, the psyche gets wings. So here we have the return of the original symbol, the lingam. It's repeated here in a new form, awake. So the lingam that was dormant and asleep in Muladhara appears here as fully conscious. The god that has been dormant is here fully awake, and this is Shiva. All right, so Shiva here, within the symbolism of the Om. Om is the mantra, the bij, the syllable, the seed syllable, the bindu, and again the crescent moon. So it's sort of a unifying symbol that reappears here. All these different elements together. Only in this time they're purified, they're white, and there's an awakening, there's an opening of consciousness here, which Jung describes as absolute reality. One is nothing but psychic reality. Psychic reality, all right? Not unconscious, not dormant, awakened psychic reality. And I love this. We are confronted with the psychic reality that one is not. In other words, beyond the ego, and that is God. God, the eternal psychical object. This word psychical is sort of, we don't really use this word anymore, but I see it as sort of what we would say today as psycho-spiritual, the eternal psycho-spiritual object, which is God. God is simply a word for the non-ego. Very interesting. Again, this is very in alignment with the Vajrayana. God is simply a word for the non-ego, the thing that is not even to be called self, the thing that you are going to disappear into. The ego disappears completely. You are absolutely identical with God. You are the force. The force, of course, being whether it's the Kundalini or the subtle energy forces of the body, or this force that is beyond all force. Again, I think this really points to Jung's. I think he really gets it. I think he, in many ways, walked this path through his own confrontation with the unconscious, and I think he can be an interpreter, because I think for him these weren't just philosophical, theoretical realities. I think he really understood much of this from an experiential level. Okay, finally, Sahasrara. Finally, in Sahasrara, it's the shortest section in the book. It's like a paragraph or so, right? I mean, there isn't much to talk about. There is no object, there is no God, there is nothing but unconditioned Brahman. There's no experience, because it is one without a second. We are in nirvana, which is, of course, non-conceptual. So in the yoga tradition, they would refer to this stage as asamprajnata samadhi, which is samadhi without support. It's just complete liberation, or kaivalya. And we'll end with this quote here from Jung: nobody touches the unconscious without leaving something of oneself there. It's sort of like playing with fire. There has to be an essential sacrifice of the self in order to enter into the waters. In order to enter into the waters, part of us does need to drown or to die in order to be reborn. Okay, so for our discussion post for this module, Jung's lectures on Kundalini Yoga represent a peak phase in the psychology-comparativist dialogue. From your perspective, how does Jung's depth psychological interpretation hold up? When is a depth psychological approach to the sacred fruitful or generative? When might it obscure the original or authentic meaning of a text or tradition? Okay, look forward to seeing what y'all come up with, and thank you so much.